Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Mr. Hartmann, not only for your kind words, but also to welcome us in this beautiful library. I never, in fact, went inside, but I'm very impressed. So we are pleased and very pleased to partner with the DC Public Library and to co-host with the first installment of the Villa Albertine's public discussion series, Democracy in an Age of Uncertainty. Smells good. French and American perspectives. The new series aims at giving a voice to French and American experts, and there are indeed, I can testify, on topics related to democracy in collaboration with leading institutions here in Washington, D.C. And it is, of course, significant that this inaugural discussion is happening just here at the venue named after Dr. King, who lost his life in the battle to defend equality and justice. So thank you so much for hosting us in a place steeped in such legacy. This year marks also the 165th anniversary of Alexis de Tocqueville's death in 1859, and it reminds us that the dialogue on democracy between our two countries has existed for 250 years now, since the time of the American Revolution. As an embassy, and therefore as representatives of the French government, it is important for us to promote this dialogue, especially at a time when our two democracies are facing numerous challenges independent of immediate political deadlines. I will not talk about the next French government. As you may know, France and the United States are part of this international partnership for information and democracy and share the need to promote an environment conducive to reliable information for citizens. That's key. In order to enable them to forge an informed opinion in a context where large-scale online misinformation and democratic processes where private stakeholders outside the democratic framework hold increasing sway, where professional journalism is weakened, and where political control over the media persists in many countries. So let me take also this opportunity to pay tribute to Christophe Deloire, the former director of Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders, who worked so hard for this project. We have arrived at a critical inflection point for democracies worldwide. Our series seeks to explore the future of our social and political models from the roles of civic engagement and community activism to wavering trust in our institutions. Together, we hope to spark insightful conversations that not only diagnose problems, but also inspire solutions. We aim to organize 3 to 4 discussions per year, so thanks to you. Extended our program until the 250th anniversary of the US Declaration of Independence in 2026. In tonight's talk, our speakers will address the challenges our democracies face with the rise of disinformation and how it is reshaping our societies. As our countries learn from each other and collaborate on strategies to counter disinformation, promoting critical thinking and protecting democratic discourses, discussion on how the informational space is being shaped today is crucial. I would like to once again express our gratitude to DCPL for hosting and co-curating this event, to Villa Albertine, the French Embassy's Institute for Culture and Education, for leading this project, and to the Embassy Press and Communication Department for their expert insights on disinformation. And I think now I have to thank you all and give the floor. No, I have to thank, last but not least, sorry, I forgot. This public discussion series would not be possible without the generous support, of Judy and Peter Bloom Culver Foundation. The foundation is a staunch supporter of cultural initiatives, including programs designed to promote French culture and further the French-American dialogue. So thank you, everyone, for being part of this important discussion. First to our speakers, our keynote speaker, Camille François, who will probably take the floor just after me. I don't know where she is. Here, oh, I was on my left. So thank you so much, Camille, and you have the floor to introduce this very important question. I hope you will say yes. Can democracy survive disinformation? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, chère Agnès. Okay, no pressure, but we have to land on a yes. So we have an evening to figure it out together. Jokes aside, I'm going to kick us off with a few remarks to frame that question of digital democracies, specifically the topic of digital disinformation. And we're going to take a minute to go back in time just a little bit, because I've had the privilege or the bad luck, depending on how you see it, to work on these issues for over a decade now. And it's helpful to think back to where we're coming to understand why 2024 is such a pivotal moment and why we have to act now, collectively and in a transatlantic fashion, to make sure that the answer to our question is a resounding yes. And so the first thing I want to do together is to do a little bit of a disentangling. Because when we say disinformation, we tend to put a lot of different things into this concept. It's a little bit of a grab bag for things that are not true on the internet. So it's like everything you disagree with, plus the stuff that your uncle says at Thanksgiving, plus AI hallucinations, and then Russian trolls. And it's a very messy landscape, which is part of what makes it very difficult to address. But it's helpful, I think, to sort of focus on subcategories of this. And what we're going to do right now is to take one of them, one strain of this problem, and to think about foreign interference. And you'll see how much foreign interference as a strand of disinformation has actually shaped the way we think about platform accountability and the way we think about content moderation. So the pivotal moment that really opened up this question of foreign interference and disinformation, and so yes, I am talking about the Russian trolls, we're going to talk about that. That pivotal moment was really 2016. And it doesn't mean that before that we didn't have such campaigns. Actually, the first type of these campaigns start in 2014. But before 2016, it was not really a public conversation, and it was mostly a blind spot, both for all of Silicon Valley and for policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. And I know that because I was working at Google at the time, and I was documenting these early signs of governments using social media to harass, to silence, and to spread lies about their perceived enemies. People were already seeing it. I was working with collectives of journalists and citizen bloggers like Global Voices and my colleague Maria Ressa. They were sounding the alarm, but it wasn't really a big topic of conversation. And more importantly, there was no consensus at all that platforms had a responsibility to do anything about it. And that changed very abruptly when it became clear that Russia had used social media to create an army of fake people and fake organizations across multiple platforms to sway the hearts and minds of American voters during the 2016 presidential election. At that time, I had left Google and I got asked to help the US Senate Select Intelligence Committee to get to the bottom of what had really happened with these Russian efforts. Meaning, I was given a USB key with data on it, and I was told, tell us what really happened. And so at the very beginning of these inquiries, powerful voices like Mark Zuckerberg were saying that the very idea that disinformation had been deployed by Russians to impact the elections was just completely preposterous. It was just a farce. And of course, by the end of these proceedings, most of the platform CEOs had been dragged in front of Congress to testify, and everybody had changed their tune to, this will never happen again, we promise. That was so sudden, and yet so important, so pivotal. And that's the beginning of the 2017 rush to put in place safeguards around disinformation, something we had never done before in Silicon Valley. And it was a very formative time where new teams were created within those departments that we call trust and safety and some of those cybersecurity departments, We created new tools. New policies were rapidly developed. And it was at a time where a lot of this had to come up quite quickly. And researchers around the world started looking into the data, started coming up with new definitions, new framework. It's also a time where a lot of new errors were made, sometimes over-enforcing. But mostly, platforms were all saying, we can and we will tackle this challenge. The Cambridge Analytica scandal in early 2018 kind of further intensified that focus on data privacy and platform responsibility. And in 2018, by the time the US midterm approached, we really saw a big shift in how disinformation was tackled. You had a formal cooperation between the US government and major social media platforms to address all these foreign interference campaigns. Multiple disinformation campaigns were identified, and they were disrupted before they could gain an audience across various platforms who were actually coordinating in between them. The platforms actually started publishing transparency reports about all the campaigns that had been taken down, saying this is what they were posting, this is who was behind it, this is how many people were reached. And that was actually a significant step forward in terms of accountability. Platforms had not been doing that on all the other topics of content moderation before. It was also a good step in tackling those issues early to avoid the downstream damage. In short, not to reproduce what had happened in 2016. And so for the first time, we were getting regular, detailed insights into both the scale and the nature of disinformation efforts directly from the platform themselves. That was in the US. In the rest of the world, platforms were still lagging behind. And for instance, you can contrast what happened in 2016 with the presidential election in the US with the French election of 2017, just a few months after. We talked about what Congress did in the US that resulted in the fact that this campaign, the Russians targeting the US election, is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of foreign interference to date. We have a wealth of information about the tactics, the reach, the content, but in France, the story was quite different. Despite facing similar threats and from the very same actors, there was no effort that ended up forcing the platforms to disclose any of that data. The legal inquiry has not been made available, and so there is still to date not a single actual public post, data point, or repository for researcher to actually understand what happened in France in 2017. That doesn't mean to say that France is still there, because since then, we've made a lot of progress. I think one of the lessons was, the platforms are not going to do this on their own. If we want to see that data, if we want to see the texture, if we want to see and understand those tactics, it has to come from the government. So in 2021, a French government agency in charge of doing this, in charge of detecting those campaigns and publishing those reports, educating the public and telling them, this is what foreign interference looks like, was created. It's called Viginium. And Viginium, to this date, continues to publish regular reports saying, this is what we're seeing in terms of the information environment. A few days earlier, it published a fun, I was going to say a fun report. I guess it's fun when you're a disinformation researcher. But it's an interesting report that I encourage you to read on the foreign interference efforts targeting the Paris Olympics. And so back in the US, the next sort of pivotal moment in our short history of handling disinformation was really the presidential election of 2020. Disinformation, electoral interference, these issues became, as you all know, incredibly politicized. Foreign actors starting pivoting tactics to more heavily invest in alternative platforms who did not have rules or processes against disinformation, and they started paying real people, influencers, small media outlets directly to launder their disinformation campaigns. That's something that they continue to do up to the lead to this election, that we continue to see them do. We'll talk about this in a second. So as a result, there was a cacophony of real people accusing each other of being Russian trolls online, which was helpful for absolutely nobody, although all the Russian trolls did think it was hilarious and made a lot of posts about that. And of course, on the lot of side of what's often labeled disinformation, you had a lot of real people saying things that are not true on social media, including presidential candidates. All of these things were amplified by algorithms, and that forced a change from the platform's perspective, because up until then, most of the rules to tackle disinformation had been focused on actors, those big manipulative actors that are behind those campaigns, or on behaviors. That's sort of the hallmarks of the deceptive campaigns. For instance, armies of fake accounts that are centrally operated, or what we call coordinated and inauthentic behavior. But if you're saying we're focusing on who are the actors, the Iranian trolls, the Russian trolls, the Chinese trolls, the trolls from all around, and then the behaviors, you're not focusing on the content. That's what we call the ABC of disinformation, for actor, behavior, and content. But in 2020, platforms shifted and started making rules about the type of content on which you're not allowed to do disinformation on platforms. Specifically, that had to do with COVID vaccines disinformation and information on how to vote. Information, for instance, that would trick people on not having their voices heard and their vote count. That, in turn, made it so that if people spread false information about this, they were suspended, and made the disinformation conversation extraordinarily politicized. And that, from 2021 onward, created a rollback of all the progress that we had made on disinformation issues from the platform's perspective. Platforms changed their tune radically. A lot of the teams who were working on enforcing these rules on disinformation were fired. Some of those trust and safety teams were entirely let go. A lot of the tools that were in place to detect those types of campaigns were unplugged. Those transparency archives still existed. Sometimes they still exist to date. They were just no longer kept. And we sort of saw that sure but steady rollback of all the efforts that had been done from 2017 onwards. It was definitely more dramatic at some platforms than others. So for instance, Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter ushered a radical change of posture on these issues. But overall, across the whole industry, the trend got clearer and clearer. Disinformation researchers, journalists, and civil society researchers who were always at the forefront of exposing this campaign also started getting severely harassed for doing so. And a lot of the critical tools that gave them the visibility into the data, that gave them the means to actually study what was going on, were unplugged. And so all of this is happening in the US, and again, I'm trying to take us on both sides of the Atlantic. Back in France, back in Europe, we actually have the Digital Services Act coming into effect. And so the first set of regulations that are meant to proactively tackle the effect of disinformation on democratic societies. This kind of leads to now. The first time we saw the European Commission take the DSA to say, no, platforms have responsibilities and must tackle disinformation was the European election very recently. And now, as we know, it's an absolutely pivotal time because over the past decade, we've learned that platforms can in fact put up safeguards to tackle the harms from disinformation to our democracies, and that we have lessons learned on this front. And there's a few things that we know, if we deploy them in a sustainable fashion, actually can help mitigate the harms. We also know that if it's solely done out of the goodness of everybody's heart and out of self-regulation in Silicon Valley, as we sometimes say, it doesn't stick and it doesn't really cross borders. So now we're about to find out if the governance systems that we designed in France, in the EU, are going to make these efforts sustainable, transparent, and global. And the sustainable part is really important because tackling disinformation and its impact on democratic society is not a sprint, it really is a marathon. And if you look at the latest Department of Justice indictment from foreign actors meddling into the upcoming election, which is focused on a Russian group called Doppelganger, this is a group that had been exposed years before by journalists and researchers, and that we're only now exposing and holding into account. This is very top of mind for me because I just unveiled a project to the French government called the États généraux de l'information, We consulted many citizens, many researchers, many people around the world on what do they want for the future of the information society, and we try to make 15 actionable recommendations to the French government and to the EU on what can be done. In consulting with everybody, the really good news is there are a series of things that can be done. They have to do with empowering the citizens, empowering researchers and journalists who play a critical role in this fight, educating people in school, holding tech accountable, tech platforms accountable, but also giving ourselves the means to find alternative online platforms for discourse, something that we shouldn't give up on, and that I think personally gives me a lot of hope. So I'm excited to continue this discussion with everybody, and thank you for letting me kick off with a look backward before we talk about 2024.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Camille. It's a great launch. Let me invite Nikole Hannah-Jones and Piotr Smolar to come up and join us up here. I'm going to ask our great host here tonight, is it okay if we take the talk and the exchange with our wonderful audience till about 8:30, and then we can get the books and the great refreshments we have? I think we're going to need to do that. Why don't you come join us up here? Great. And if anybody wants these, oh, I see. Yeah, if anybody wants these great seats in front, just come take them. I told Nikole that she could wink at me if she wanted the water down there, and I would, lean down and get it for her. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Steve Clemons. I'm a journalist here in Washington. I've been an editor-at-large of nearly every publication in town except the New York Times, but The Hill, The Atlantic, Semaphore. I am a contributing editor at National Interest, and I am deeply, deeply interested in this subject. And we've got a fantastic panel. We know Camille Francois. We've got Piotr Smolar, who is the special correspondent for Le Monde here, and he covers just about everything. And of course, we have Nikole Hannah-Jones, who was the founder of the 1619 Project. She's a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine. And I think we have a tough subject, and I want to challenge this notion that we will come out at yes on whether democracies are resilient to this. I think it takes the tension out of the moment, and I think it undermines the risks that are part of the conversation I think we're about to have. And I want to broaden it in a way because, I think we all draw on personal experience, and I want to give everyone permission. You can go micro, you can go macro, you can go historic. But as I think about it in my own experience growing up, I grew up as an Air Force brat. I was an Air Force dependent, grew up on military bases around the world. In 1980, I went to UCLA and took the Political Science 1 course. And it was all about this thing I'd never heard about called the Vietnam War. I grew up in military schools and never had been taught or educated about the Vietnam War by the time I got to UCLA in 1980. And I felt I had been, just fed a view of America's place in the world, of American history, and just missed the atrocious history that we had just, come through. My parents weren't particularly educationally inclined, and it gave me my first real dose of how dangerous it is if you have too much control feeding the information. I would love, for instance, to have de Tocqueville go through Springfield, Ohio. That as we sit here today and we're talking about disinformation and democracy, I can't get they're eating our cats, they're eating their dogs out of my head. And J.D. Vance's comments this weekend on CNN, on Dana Bash's comment, basically saying we have to make up stories now and then to get your attention on things. And she stopped and just froze, saying, wow, the vice presidential nominee for the Republican ticket just admitted, in fact, this. So I want to start with Nikole and just ask, and have a conversation here, to ask this question that has been bothering me. Is disinformation in democracy and the struggle that we're talking about today a recent phenomena, or has it been with us for a very long period of time?
Okay, good evening, everyone. So one, let me first acknowledge that's a rhetorical question, right? We know
Kinda.
We know disinformation is not new, just the technology in which it's delivered is new. So no, it's not. And clearly I am a critic of our founders, of our official founders, but something that our founders did understand and that they did get right, explicitly Thomas Jefferson is that democracy requires an informed citizenry, that if people are to elect those who govern them, then they have to actually be informed. So I think it's important that we, one, define the terms. There's a difference between misinformation and disinformation. Both can be harmful, but misinformation is just someone gives you bad information, they may or may not mean to. Of course, what we're dealing with is disinformation, where there is intent behind the disinformation, and the disinformation, the bad information is designed to manipulate, it's designed for propaganda, and that is as old, I imagine, as humanity, right? That people have intentionally misled for their own political aims. I think what's clearly particularly dangerous about the time that we're in now is it is becoming increasingly difficult to tell the difference, to be able to verify facts, to be able to find out what is the truth. And I think about when you bring up that example of Springfield, I've been thinking a lot about this. So when J.D. Vance says that we have to create stories every now and then to get your attention, and we're all shocked that he would actually say out loud what we've all suspected. But what they're doing, about Haitians eating cats, dogs, geese, duck, whatever animal it is that they're choosing, that's just the latest iteration in a campaign that many journalists have largely succumbed to, right? The anti-CRT campaign, where there were lies about what was being taught in the classroom that led us to believe that a teaching force that's 80% white is telling white children that they're the oppressor, right? That was disinformation, and yet most journalists were not reporting it that way. Right, so we see the anti-DEI campaign, which is leading to the shuttering of multicultural centers. It's, again, this belief that white people were being subjected to oppressive trainings and oppressive institutions. That too was disinformation. That could have been easily verified, and yet we didn't. So when J.D. Vance goes to the extreme and says, okay, now they're eating dogs and cats, then we can all kind of recognize, that sounds a little crazy. So then we check out that disinformation and we try to debunk that disinformation. But the much more harmful disinformation that is now becoming legislation that's actually impacting people's lives was in that same racist vein. And yet we all largely, even as journalists, succumb to that.
But let me just catch this point between you and Camille. I mean, Camille, you may agree with Nicole just shared, but a lot of what you talked about was an ongoing process of foreign-born disinformation, state-based disinformation, attempting to manipulate through our social media and digital platforms. And what I've heard from Nicole, and I agree, is we have a lot of disinformation that's homegrown, authentic, right here in the United States. I sort of saw a lot of this going on, during the Afghanistan war, when I saw and I heard, and we reported about it on the Pentagon, basically buying perspectives and having these perspectives appear in op-ed pages. And anybody that covered the battleground and knew people at war knew that what they were reading in these, the leading op-ed pages of this country was not in alignment with what was really happening. And so I guess I want to jump to Piotr in a moment, but one more quick thing, Nicole, is a lot of what we're talking about, did the norm of somehow Americans being easily seduced into believing conspiracy theories and not believing the New York Times, did that start at home and not necessarily with Russia?
Oh, I think it's always been both. So we can go back to the Revolutionary War period. So let's be clear. The reason why so many foreign actors spread disinformation about race is because race is the Achilles heel of American politics. So if you want people to believe disinformation, if you want to divide people politically, you go to that space that people are most vulnerable in. And in America, that has long been race. So during the Revolutionary War, the British were spreading rumors about the white colonists in America. And they were saying, they're going to free all the slaves and make them rise up against you. Well, that was never the actual intent, right? But you understand that if you scare people by race in America, which was founded on that being kind of our original tension point, our political tension point, that's highly effective. So much of the Russian disinformation was targeted towards Black communities, right? It was targeted towards white Americans who had racial animus, and that you see that happening during the Cold War. That exact same tactic happens during the Cold War as they play into these racial stereotypes and these racial divisions. And of course, we're seeing it happen. Now we saw it happen under Obama, and we're seeing it happen under Donald Trump. So what we have not learned is our inability to grapple with the fundamental divide of race is what makes us our society, I can't speak for every other society, but our society in general, much more vulnerable to these type of outside attacks. So it's coming from inside the house, but it's also coming from outside the house, because our adversaries know us very well. We're in denial, right? As Americans, we're in denial to the extent that race is what drives our politics. We want to talk about economic anxiety. We want to talk about all of these other things. But race animates American politics and American political divides. And our adversaries know that better sometimes than we do.
Piotr, I want you to help broaden this to a transatlantic perspective, but I want you to help me understand something. In the I guess in the early 2000s, I was a political blogger, one of the first political bloggers, along with Josh Marshall. I had the Washington Note. And boy, if I got a comma in the wrong place, if I accidentally got some issue wrong, I had a senator's name incorrect, or I had something conceptually just out of alignment, I got a literal storm of criticism and correction. And I said, wow, we're all going to have a self-correct mechanism in the internet, that it's going to help us stay on the straight path. And I mean, it became an information. Where did it go from being the place that people were out there helping to correct problems, to help stay on a path of fact-based commentary and journalism, and it become actually the font of such staggering disinformation? And you know it's happened in Europe as much as it's happened in America. Would love to get your perspective on how this ecosystem has taken over. Because I think it gets down to this question, can democracy be resilient and stand in this? And I think we're asking ourselves, maybe not. Maybe not.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Wow, a very broad question.
You can make it as specific as you like.
I will try to. First, I would argue that there is, lines are blurred right now as far as disinformation is concerned between domestic issues and foreign interference. And I think that Camille really brilliantly talked about this earlier. I think the main purpose of disinformation is not to present an alternative truth, but is to kill trust. Trust in the words of real experts, medical experts, climate experts, trust in our elections and in the process of choosing your representatives or your president, trust in institutions themselves, and in the possibility of a civil conversation between citizens. And this is our greatest weakness. We believe that this conversation is still possible. And our adversaries bet on the fact that they can destroy us from within by destroying the trust. And one of the most fascinating things about this time we're living in is that we don't know how to define war anymore. Do we live in a state of war? Is this war? I'm not talking about war on the battlefield. We know what a war is in Gaza or in Ukraine. I'm talking about psychological warfare, a situation in which we are permanently unsecured and attacked, even though sometimes we don't know we're being attacked. And sometimes I think of disinformation, sorry for this weird comparison, but it's a little bit like a virus, like COVID, which enters your body. Sometimes you don't have any symptoms, but it moves inside your body and it looks for weaknesses. So sometimes you don't even notice it, but actually sometimes you're just a mess because of it. And So talking about this real difficulty to define if we were in a time of war or peace, we just had the Olympic Games in France. And it was, of course, a wonderful moment. We were very worried about the security threat and everything, but we were very proud of this sportive event. But at the same time, and you mentioned the special government structure that exists, who monitors all those sort of disinformation attacks against us. They picked 43 attacks against France during those Olympic Games. And then we're talking about major disinformation attacks against France. Fake Hamas militants threatening that there's going to be an attack against France. Videos with people pouring some sort of blue liquid inside the Seine River because the mayor of Paris wanted the Seine to be totally clean for sports events in it.
This is happening to Springfield, Ohio today. So all of the people that have been instigated to focus on this poor city in this town in Ohio are subjecting city governments, schools, elementary schools, civic organizations to all kinds of threats. And the frequency, I'll get to Camille in a moment, but the frequency and the decibel level of, I would call, disinformation and fake information that's being deployed and assaulted against these institutions is staggeringly high right now.
Yes, and the purpose, again, is not to convince you of something. No. It's to make you feel insecure. That's the key thing. Because when you feel insecure,
so let me ask
don't trust anymore.
Let me ask you a question. I'm a journalist, you're a journalist, Nicole Hannah-Jones is a journalist. I'm okay with people not necessarily trusting the New York Times or Semaphore or The Hill or Le Monde, as long as they didn't trust everything else as well. Like if you had a reset with all of our audience here, and I said, I'm going to give you a task, don't trust anything. But I come up with this scientific experiment, and a good number of you are more prone to trusting conspiracy purveyors than trusting the institutions that have been around. But if you didn't trust anything, it would be an interesting opportunity for a civic reset so we could get back to how this great library and institution, or how our media organizations, or how TikTok, or et cetera, could re-earn the trust of people. Why do you think it's so easy for certain people to become, to lose trust in everything real and to yet trust the things that aren't real?
I don't know if they trust the things that are unreal, but when you don't have a hierarchy anymore between different voices, if you don't recognize that they are experts in certain fields, when everyone's opinion has exactly the same value, so this is when trouble starts. It's not that when a historian works on a certain period for years and years, I would rather listen to him than somebody who comes out of a bar and say, hey, by the way, the Middle Age, that's the way it was, So this is, I think, a major issue. And just coming back to like a small history point, I can share with you just a personal experience. Camille mentioned the fact that 2016 was really like a sort of pivotal moment. 2 years before, I was on the Independence Square in Kiev during the Maidan Revolution in February 2014. And what happened at the time is that people from all around Ukraine gathered on this Independence Square and protested because they thought that the country was being stolen from them. I mean, the European perspective was being stolen from them. And they protested. Right. And at the time, the regime sent special forces against them, and about 100 people were killed, and the president, Yanukovych, had to flee. And so I was there on the square, and I witnessed all this. Peaceful demonstrators, violence, etc. And at the same time, right away, started a huge campaign of disinformation online from the Russian side, saying that basically Nazis had gathered on the Independence Square.
Right.
And so for me, already at the time, it wasn't as organized and as sophisticated as today's campaigns. But I was really, really struck at the time by the fact that obvious facts that I was laying my eyes on, that were just before me, they were rewritten in Moscow in a totally different way. That realities didn't seem to matter anymore. And actually, because I lived in Russia for a few years, I
Right.
have friends there, I couldn't talk to them anymore because even people really close to me, because they were persuaded that Nazis were taking over in Ukraine. And so this is really an issue. I'm even
Right.
talking not as a journalist, but just as a citizen of the world.
Right.
That was incredibly shocking. It was a shocking experience.
Yeah, could
Sure.
I also want to agree and kind of push back on this idea that the answer is don't trust anything, right? I mean, one, as people.
Well, I'm not sure it is the answer. It's just I wish if you were going to get a reset. It's just
I don't
interesting.
think that that's
yeah.
the reset, though. I think, so one, as journalists, all we have is credibility.
Right.
There's no reason that anyone should believe anything that I write except I have been credible in the past, right?
Right.
That what I have written has been based on verifiable fact and people trust that what I'm saying. Not that I will never get anything wrong, but if I get something wrong, it is not intentional and I will correct it. So what we're saying, and this is where I agree with you, that really the aim is to say trust nothing, the end of expertise. There are no experts. So whether I'm a climate change scientist or I'm just someone who goes outside and looks at the weather, that I have the exact same amount of credibility, that anyone and any information from anywhere can be deemed as credible. That, I mean, when we think about, again, what happened with anti-CRT, was anti-CRT really about what was being taught in the classroom? No.
Right.
It was about destroying public education. It was about sowing distrust in public institutions.
Right.
So you begin by attacking the credibility so that a parent will say, yes, you went to school, you got a PhD in education, you as an educational expert have determined what the curriculum should be, but I as a parent should decide. And even though I have no expertise in history, math, English, or education, I should decide because anyone can be an expert. These are about destroying the fiber of institutions. So, no, I think we do. You know, the 1619 Project is about critiquing certain people in power's version of history.
Right.
But it is not critiquing it from a place of no expertise.
Right.
It is saying there are other expertise out there that we should be listening to. But what happened with the 1619 Project, we had historians, political scientists, people who had vast amount of learning. We spent a year on it, and Trump could put out the 1776 Commission without a single expert in American history and hold these two
No one.
things and say they're the same.
Yeah.
So you just choose which version you believe. That's what's very dangerous about the moment we're in, is we all can just choose which versions of reality we believe, but there is an actual reality.
Well, it's a really important point, and I tell everybody that when we recently got together a bunch of leading scientists, the head of NIH, National Science Foundation, we opened it by basically saying, you know, we're on the edge of all these technological revolutions and extraordinary expertise in America, in Europe, around the world. But if Galileo were still alive, I think he'd still be in jail. You know, and so there's this tension, honestly, out there, which is what we're getting at. So very, very important point. Camille, I had chills running down my spine as you talked, and you talked about the scale at which this is happening, the sophistication, which is what the digital dimensions of disinformation give you. And when you put behind them nefarious players and, as Piotr just said, looking for weaknesses in society, but add digital twins, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, avatars, deep fakes, and this next wave, and this is what really scares me, is I'm not convinced we're doing such a good job, and you may be able to convince me later that Mark Zuckerberg's not a bad guy, or you know that some of these folks with huge capacity, huge databases are somehow trustable in the long run. I'm not sure, and I doubt it. But when you add on the technology that we're seeing come on now, isn't everything you outlined just about to explode?
I'll answer that question, but before I do, I just wanted to say I'm very grateful that you shared this anecdote of standing in the square and hearing people say it was Nazis. Because remember, I talked about this congressional investigation where I was given this hard drive, thumb drive, with the data of the US interference on it. And of course, what really was on it is the data of the US interference plus whatever those guys were up to before. And there was a lot of the data that you just talked about. And we were able to go back to the activists, to go back to the journalists who were in Ukraine and elsewhere and said, hey guys, you were not crazy. This is in fact coming from the very same building that later attacked those democracies. And again, the only reason why this got exposed is because at this moment in time, in 2016, somebody said, okay, enough, let's unravel and understand what had
Right.
happened. So now those good trolls in the troll farms have access to AI. They have for a long time. The first time I saw a large-scale campaign that was using AI to create fake profile pictures, to do like a lot of like fake profiles, was 2019. So that was, at the time, still fairly cheap and effective to do that. It was before ChatGPT became very popular, so it's 2023. But all this to say, it's not exactly new in terms of, yes, it helps create synthetic content, it helps create fake content, and sometimes people worry a lot about that. I think it's helpful to sort of go back on the underlying issues with the distribution, right? More often than not, if you're trying to create disinformation, your problem is not to create the bad content, is to distribute it at scale. And so here, what's really making this problem complicated isn't that we have found a way to automate hatred, is that we still don't have the safeguards that we need to prevent those harassment campaigns. The most common harmful use of AI today isn't by foreign interference actors to do campaigns. It's by a lot of people who are using it to create deepfakes, who often target women, who often target women in the public eye, political candidates, journalists, and these are used, again, for campaigns to silence and for campaigns to spread hatred. So I think that what worries me, we go back to sort of like our inability to have more structured accountability for platforms. The other thing, of course, is, and Nicole, you talked about this, trust is earned. And we've kind of sprinkled generative AI on a bunch of things without really telling people what exactly it is.
Right.
At the end of the day, it's a prediction engine.
But let me.
And when I see a lot of people sort of turn to generative AI to have fun, because it's really fun, that's there's a bunch of creative things you can do, but also a lot of people turn to generative AI and ask questions like you would of a search engine, or like you would looking for an article that's been written by a real expert or by a trusted journalist. And it was not made for that. Of course, this is what we call hallucination, but that is even a little bit of a misnomer, right? The idea of hallucination would mean that the expectation is that it retrieves factual information, but it was never designed for that.
Right.
It's designed to do a prediction on what is the most likely thing that may come out after the thing you said. And I think if people understand that better, they will know, oh, I definitely can't trust it for medical advice. However, it will be very fun to create whatever, an invitation for a party, right?
So let me take it one step further. I mean, I may be a little bit more concerned about what happens at scale with the digital backbone you just shared in your fascinating and important talk, because I think that it extends further and expands the tools. I hope that I'd like to get to the remedies in a moment. But there's another side to this, because you're actually talking about other countries that are manipulating out there. And I've always wondered, why aren't we, the collective we, doing it to them? Where's deterrence in this equation? Not.
But we are,
not,
and I don't know if
well,
that's a good
I'd be
idea,
interested
though.
to be. This could be a really good argument. I've talked to a lot of senior government. I've been reporting on this and working on it. I find what we're doing to be pretty paltry. And if you had Senator Warner up here or someone from the Intelligence Committee, they would say that we reformed ourselves out of those 1950s skill sets of manipulating another government. So it would be great to know if we're wrong or right. But it is interesting that deterrence doesn't seem to be as big a factor in deterring Russian behavior or some of the the state or non-state behavior. But maybe you have a different view.
So, well, the first thing is, both the US and France have been exposed for using some of these tactics by researchers and by journalists. Mostly they don't react particularly well to being exposed for doing that. And then ensues a debate about, is this really what democratic governments, should behave like? And I think that's the first important question, which is, how do we want our democratic governments to engage? Do we want them creating armies of fake profiles to manipulate other audiences abroad? What does it do to our message about the importance of trust in democracy? So this is the first set of questions. The second set of questions is, what tools do we have when we see these campaigns happen to make them stop? And I think here we see the importance and strength of sanctions. The recent indictment in
Right.
the US that I just talked about focuses on this group that was targeting the US upcoming election in 2024. They detailed very explicitly, this is what you're doing, this is who's doing it, this is what's going to happen to you. And I think this sort of like putting this back in the context of the rule of law,
Right.
using sanctions so far has proven quite effective, because every time you do this, you also share a lot of information that empower other actors, journalists, activists, researchers, platforms to go and actually understand what's happening and then
Right.
find the next campaigns.
Nicole,
So
you pushed.
we're slow,
Yeah.
we're getting there.
Right. Nicole, you pushed back a little bit on the fact of aren't we doing that? Do you think we are actively, the United States, Europe, our allies are actively engaged in similar kinds of destabilizing disinformation abroad?
Of course.
Okay.
I mean, Cuba. We do this exact thing in Cuba. We've been doing this exact same thing in Cuba, and I think in many other parts of the world. The United States is not an innocent imperialist power. Everything that's being practiced on us, we are
Right.
also doing in other places. We just are only concerned about it, of course, when it happens to us.
And I would agree with Cuba. I would probably we can talk about this in the drinking and the books part later. But Piotr, let me come in and just want to just very quickly in this session, because I want to get to audience questions, ask you if you have any models out there that you've seen, because I think one of the things that I'm interested in is what are the protections one can have against this. I mean, what can you do? You can talk about educating your society. I loved how Nicole talked about having an informed citizenry is so vital. You know, I live in a gusher of news. I would say that, you know, critical thinking and being able to look and teach your citizens how important it is to look at multiple sources and weigh this. This is all just so logical to someone like me, but for some reason, for a substantial part of the American population, and I assume European populations, the rise of populism to some degree is being driven by people who don't think that equation of critical thinking, of being informed, for some reason is working for them. So I'm interested, Piotr, if you have any thoughts on remedies or models, and I'd like to ask all three of you before we go to the audience, what sorts of best and promising practices can we put in place to get us closer to yes and democracy surviving this than to no?
So the easy way out is to say education. That's the obvious answer. And actually, I think it's true. So it really depends on the day. Sometimes I'm really totally depressed. Sometimes I'm pretty optimistic. You know, in the first century before Christ, there was a king called Mithridates VI. And because of him, we have this sophisticated word called Mithridatization, which means to swallow small doses of poison in order to have a more resilient body against this poison. The thing is that it doesn't always work because it depends on the poison. And sometimes Mithridatization actually kills you. So I'm saying this because I have the feeling that throughout this last period, people have become more wary, more accustomed to manipulation and to disinformation. So the bad side is that paranoia is also on the march. But grown-up citizens, I think they are much more careful when they are presented evidence. And I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing for institutions, like, as you mentioned, the New York Times or Le Monde, and it's especially a good thing when when you are in the deep seas of the internet.
Camille?
I'll take the opposite tack. Sure, education has a role to play. It's so important. I also think it's important to talk about the things that are not on the people to defend themselves against. And having worked a lot with victims of these foreign information campaigns, right? People who were completely manipulated, inevitably at some point they look at me and they said, what should I have done differently? When should I have known? And then I have to explain, it is not your fault. Some of that is a platform accountability problem. Some of that is a national security issue that we need our governments to resource, and we need to resource it, understanding how disproportionately it impacts some people that, frankly, we don't do enough to protect, including journalists. And I think it's really important to talk about this hand in hand with the education solution,
Right.
because otherwise it's a little bit like, oh, let's make sure that the people are not so gullible anymore. It's not just on them. There's also a whole host of things to do with governments from a national security perspective, with platforms to increase their responsibility, but also to create these alternative tech spaces, alternative discussion spaces, right? Some of that is also, you said it, like the information superhighway is so concentrated. We also want people to be able to have those discussions elsewhere too. So it's about imagining a different future. And it's just not wholly, fully only on the people.
Okay, I'm going to get Nicole's comments here, but I really appreciate her comments about credibility and trust and understanding that this takes a lot of time to build. But I'm sitting here still struggling with the fact that a former president of the United States said something that was demonstrably untrue about Springfield, Ohio, and eating dogs and cats, which has captured this nation in an extremely unhealthy way and divided people over a ludicrous assertion who came from a pillar of authority, of someone who's looked at as a pillar of authority. And I don't know, and this gets into the question, I'm not so sure that it's easy to come out at yes, because when you have something like that happen from someone who was in the White House for 4 years, and you have to understand, I'm an independent. I try to be absolutely judiciously dispassionate in this, but I don't know, when I was thinking about this today, and I saw that debate, and I said, oh my God, how are we going to sort of talk honestly about that moment, that a substantial portion of people are being forced to deny truth as a litmus test of their loyalty? And I don't know how you get around that. Nicole?
I've got the answer. Just kidding. You got to blow this shit up and start all over. No. So I would agree with both of you. So on the one hand, I am a believer in a strong regulatory government. I think that the belief that individual citizens who have their own lives, let me tell you, I don't know how none of this shit works. I'm a very intelligent woman, but I don't know how this works. And so we're expecting regular people who are trying to raise their kids, do their job, pay their bills, to somehow not succumb to these highly sophisticated campaigns that are being orchestrated against us. I think that's ridiculous. So I don't think we can give up the need for our government to do what our government is supposed to do, which is work to protect the citizens. So I think that that is critical. But I also think education clearly does matter. And I think the way that we have come to treat education as being about creating workers, about the market, and not about helping people to learn how to think matters, right? Because people don't know how to discern information. We have more information than ever. We don't know how our government works. We don't know how to determine what is a credible source or not. You have politicians who are serving in Congress right now who are spreading fake news stories from fake news outlets because they don't know themselves, or they have no interest in determining what is a credible source. And the third thing I will say is that this hyper-polarization that we are in as a country makes us more susceptible to bad information and misinformation. We are not motivated to learn the truth because it is confirming what we want to believe about the other side. And so we have to also grapple with this rot in our society that has us so deeply polarized. This is what foreign entities exploit, is that polarization. It's people who are going to want to believe that cat story, even though we know logically it doesn't make sense, even though we know we've seen no proof of it. So we've got to deal with those three things. I don't think any of it can be done on our own. But my problem with saying it's just education is we now have a society where therefore the blame is on us. And there is no role, right? When we have oligarchs, when we have a Mark Zuckerberg, when we have someone like Elon Musk who are in charge of the main means of information, I can write a story in the New York Times. You will probably never see it if it doesn't come across your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed, and yet they can determine whether you'll see it or not, whether you'll see me or you'll see Fox News. I can always tell when Fox News is talking about me because I'm not on Facebook, but my mom sees everything that the right says about me.
That's
and
great.
Nothing positive that might be reported on me, right? So we as an individual citizen cannot fix that. That is the role of government. That's why we have a government. That is how democracy works. And so we have to demand more of ourselves, but we certainly have to demand much more of our government.
Let's get a couple of questions from our audience, and then, yeah, 2 questions, and then we're going to move here. So we've got a question right here. Make it a quick question. I think a microphone is coming to you, right? No? Oh, why don't you stand and just share it, and I'll repeat the question for the tape.
I got a booming voice. I hear.
Okay, great.
So, I have a Don Draper question. For those who don't remember him, there's a scene in which he says about I think Lucky Strike. They're losing this big cigarette account. That's 25% of their revenue. So he takes out an ad in the New York Times or something, right, and says that he's given up smoking. He can no longer. It's unconscionable to take their money. We
Right.
watch him writing this.
I gotta
book,
use
so
short
I'm
form,
getting-
yeah.
I'm getting it.
Yeah.
I promise. And he says, if you don't like what they're saying, change the story.
Right.
My background is I'm Indian American. I have family members who get it about Trump, don't get it about Modi. And what I'm curious about, both in the modalities of
Right.
government, of education, everything you're talking about, should we just change this story rather than constantly trying to debunk the story? Because so much of framing is every time you try to debunk the story is you've told the story. I've been
So-
counting you talking about the pets, and I'm like, let's stop saying
Right.
it. So
I would love to.
That's not
I
a
just,
challenge on you.
I got to get past it. But let me say it because we have online viewers. Say, why don't we get past the story by changing the story as opposed to debunking the story? That's interesting a point.
Well, not just you have to tell a new story.
Tell a new story.
And I'm curious
Right.
about
Right.
your work in that.
Piotr?
I think you're making an incredibly important point because, and I think it's a fantastic opportunity for serious media and for serious newspapers. So we have, I think we lived for years under the illusion that we could debunk all the lies that surround us. And actually we've lost, I'm not saying this work didn't matter, but we lost, I think, a lot of energy on doing that, and I'm not sure it was always very successful. Because, you know, people are convinced, people are convinced. So, so I think that if you decide to work seriously and describe reality as it is, and,
Right.
and not only give your opinion, because that's the main problem. I mean, the change in the media landscape, I could talk about this for hours, but look at what has happened here. In France also to a certain extent, but especially here. You almost don't have any local newspapers anymore. And local newspapers do matter, whatever you think of their quality, but it's also a social link between people. It's an identity link between people. And
Camille?
when you don't have local newspapers, well, you know, people are left all alone with the computer.
And by the way, local news is the most trusted. So we are losing in our communities the most trusted source of news that we have, which I think is also very critical. And just to quickly piggyback on that, I've said this, you know, I founded a center
Right.
at Howard called the Center for Journalism and Democracy because I felt journalism was failing in this moment. And part of our problem is we actually become agents of misinformation by repeating disinformation.
Right.
And we do it all the time. And so if your headline says, Trump says XYZ, but not Trump lied when he
Right.
said XYZ, then we actually are furthering disinformation while
Right.
we are supposed to be doing the opposite. And I think that's very dangerous.
And
Thank you.
If I may just add
Really
one thing.
quick.
If I were a billionaire, that's always a good beginning for a story. If I were a billionaire and I wanted to invest money for the sake of democracy and institutions and the health of the society I live in, I would invest in newspapers and, for example, in local newspapers. As you know, not to make money, but for philanthropy sake. And I think that's really a good advice that could be given to some very rich
We'll
people.
have that argument another day. I think there's a
My
problem
advice
when
is we should
billionaires.
tax billionaires at
Yeah.
the right rate, and then we as the people
Yeah.
can decide what we
Right,
fund.
there you go. But, okay, I'm going to take this one last question here. We'll go to Camille. I'm sorry,
Oh,
we
that's
got
very French
no
of
time,
you.
unfortunately. Yeah, we'll get to you.
Appreciate
Yes,
I'll interject as well.
just make it short.
I know what you mean about information overload. We've got Twitter, we've got Facebook, we've got
Right.
we've got all this stuff happening. So I mean this actually legitimately as a librarian, not just a library.
Right.
But how much do you talk to librarians about verified information? Like what I do is I get verified information
Right.
understand it, to digest information, to tell the truth. Not just
Absolutely fascinating question about, for our viewing audience, about the role librarians play in essentially organizing information, slowing things down in a very high-paced, turbocharged news and media world in which this goes, and how are we talking and building librarians into that. I'm going to go to Camille first. Camille?
Well, I'm fully convinced. And to sort of like do the bridge with the first question, I'm the only one on stage who is not a journalist. I wish I was, but okay, it's okay. Okay.
Okay, great.
You know, and so I don't get to tell fun stories. I have the boring,
Right.
sort of more researchy role of
Right.
when I see the totally mad, insane story,
Yeah.
my job isn't to think, well, what's the better story I can tell? What's the
Right.
reframe? My job is to be like, oh, where's that one coming from? How did it travel all the way there?
Right.
And I think the folks who do this sort of like, you know, focused on preserving the actual facts and knowledge and understanding how the stories disseminate and sort of like tracing the archaeology of how did it go from here to there to the president's mouth
Right.
to viral on Twitter. It's also the flip side of what we need. And I think in this context, librarians are so important. Librarians and digital librarians, right? I think about the folks who are digitalizing knowledge, not just to feed
Right.
you know, large language models, but so that knowledge is accessible, people can contextualize it, people have access to the source material, and I worry that we're going to enter a world where people have less and less access to the source material.
Right.
There was a great story, and I read it in 404 Media yesterday, that said, when you Google for one of the most famous art paintings, now Google, instead of showing you the actual painting, which of course it has, it shows you an AI-generated reconstruction of it. I fear for the people who are going to be exposed to this for the first time.
Right.
And, you know, I think in this context, of course, librarians are extraordinarily
Right.
important in making sure we can continue to curate a word of facts
Thank you.
and of sources.
Thank you. Piotr, final comment?
No,
Are you
It's
okay?
a-
You're
no,
in
no, it's-
violent
it-
agreement.
it's a-
That's
it's a-
great.
No, it's a fascinating example. I'll just say that, you know, I have a son, he's 11, and he's not getting an iPhone.
Okay, great. Knocking out. Nicole, I'm going to give you the last word on the role of librarians.
I love libraries.
There you go.
What else can I say?
I would just say in my editorial comment, I love librarians and libraries too, but I don't know how you do your job when in fact we used to be working in books, then digital books. There was a neatness to information, and information has become so messy, so everywhere, so constant. How do you punctuate the beginning and end of things anymore? I think it's a very interesting challenge. I'm really happy you raised that question. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We're going to break to the books that have been offered, to the reception, and I just want to say a few words of thanks. First, I want to thank Villa Albertine and this fantastic Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Public Library and the DC Library Foundation for this, and of course the Kovler Foundation, which supported this. But I also want to thank the folks here, because we're wrestling with tough subjects. The fact that you gave up an evening, that you came up here, is a really, really important sign that this battle may not be over, or even near over. So I want to thank Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times and the 1619 Project, Piotr Smoler from Le Monde, and Camille Francois of the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Thank you all so much.